Smash that subscribe button, hit like your life depends on it, and tell me in the comments if you think you could survive even 1 week on this menu, because what you're about to see isn't just food, it's control. The alarm didn't signal an escape. It signaled silence. At 5:12 a.m., inside one of America's most fortified Supermax facilities, a correctional officer noticed something wrong. Breakfast had been delivered. The steel slot in cell block D was locked back into place. But the tray inside cell D-214 hadn't moved. In a place where every routine is measured to the second, an untouched tray is not a minor detail. It's a warning. Officer Ramirez leaned closer to the reinforced glass. Inside, under the harsh fluorescent glow, inmate Marcus Hale sat on the concrete slab that passed for a bed. His hands rested on his knees. His eyes were open. He was staring at the tray on the floor as if it were a message written in code. On the tray, powdered eggs already stiffening into rubber, a pale biscuit sealed in plastic, and a small carton of milk. Total cost to the federal system? Roughly $1.42. In this prison, food isn't comfort. It's currency. It's compliance. It's leverage. And today, someone had refused it. Within minutes, the corridor filled with the mechanical echo of boots and the low murmur of radios. Refusing meals in a Supermax isn't just about hunger. It can signal protest, manipulation, or preparation for something worse. Hale wasn't an ordinary inmate. 10 years earlier, he'd orchestrated a coordinated bombing plot across 3 states. He never carried a weapon himself. He never planted a device. He simply directed, calculated, and vanished into layers of encrypted communication until the FBI closed in. Now he lived alone in an 8x10 concrete box, 23 hours a day. And this morning he had declined the one thing the system guaranteed him: food. Warden Elise Carter stood in the observation room, watching the feed from the cell camera. She had spent 25 years in federal corrections. She knew violence. She knew manipulation. And she knew that inside these walls, power shifted in the smallest details. "Has he eaten anything in the last 24 hours?" she asked. "Dinner untouched last night," Ramirez replied. "Lunch was half-eaten." Carter narrowed her eyes. "Monitor him. Every 10 minutes. In a Supermax facility, meals are standardized, calculated, stripped of individuality. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. Delivered through a narrow slot in the door. No cafeteria chatter. No clinking trays across long tables. Just a brief metallic scrape as the tray slides in. To the public, prison food is a punchline. To inmates in America's most secure units, it's one of the few daily markers of time. When you can't see the sun rise or set, you measure your existence in trays. Hale's refusal wasn't impulsive. He was too strategic for that. Across the compound, in the administrative wing, investigative journalist Claire Donnelly waited in a secure conference room. She had been granted rare access to document the food system inside America's Supermax facilities. Months of requests, background checks, legal waivers. Her focus was simple: how does the federal government feed the most dangerous inmates in the country? But as she flipped through her notes, caloric charts, procurement contracts, supplier bids, she sensed something else. Something under the surface. She had interviewed former inmates who described the food as bland but sufficient. Others claimed portions were deliberately reduced as punishment. Official statements denied that claim. Meals met nutritional standards, they said. No more, no less. Control, not cruelty. When Warden Carter entered the room, she didn't waste time. "You'll see exactly how it works," Carter said. "But understand this. In here, food is part of the security system." Claire raised an eyebrow. Security? Yes. Predictability. Routine. Incentive. You behave, you eat. You follow protocol, you maintain privileges. Break the rules, and you might find yourself on what's called a restricted diet. Claire had read about it. A controversial disciplinary measure sometimes referred to as Nutriloaf. A dense, baked mixture designed to meet nutritional requirements but remove all pleasure from eating. "It's legal," Carter said firmly, anticipating the question. "Court approved. Nutritionally complete." Claire wrote that down. Nutritionally complete. Back in cell D214, Hale finally stood. He picked up the tray, walked to the stainless steel sink toilet combo, and dumped the entire breakfast into the basin. Milk carton crushed. Eggs sliding down the drain. He wasn't starving. He was sending a message. By noon, 2 more inmates in separate units had refused their meals. Coincidence? Unlikely. The facility went into modified movement protocol. Extra checks. Limited staff rotations. Intelligence officers began scanning recorded phone calls and mail logs for coded communication. In Supermax, coordination is almost impossible. Almost. Claire stood behind a reinforced glass partition, watching the kitchen operations later that afternoon. The kitchen itself was a study in industrial efficiency, stainless steel counters, bulk ingredients stacked in labeled bins, portions measured with mechanical precision. Each tray was assembled the same way. No substitutions. No customization beyond medically required diets. What's the daily cost per inmate? Claire asked the food services administrator. Varies slightly, he replied, but typically between $3 and $5 a day. $3 to $5 to sustain the most dangerous inmates in America. It wasn't starvation. It wasn't indulgence. It was calculated survival. Dinner that evening, baked chicken patty, rice, canned green beans, a slice of bread, and a small dessert square. In D214, the tray slid through the slot again. Hale looked at it. This time, he didn't touch it at all. At 7:43 p.m., the monitoring system flagged a pattern. Multiple inmates across different blocks were declining meals in sync. The refusals weren't random. They were timed. Warden Carter convened an emergency meeting. "This is coordinated," she said. "They're using the meal system to communicate." "How?" an officer asked. Carter pointed to the screen. "Refusal patterns. Breakfast, yes. Lunch, no. Dinner, it's binary. Yes or no." The code. In a prison where letters are screened and calls recorded, food trays had become the last unfiltered signal. Claire wasn't cleared to hear the internal briefing, but she sensed the tension shift in the facility. Doors locked down earlier. Lights dimmed sooner. Inside his cell, Hale sat cross-legged on the floor. He wasn't weak. He wasn't desperate. He was calculating. At 9:15 p.m., intelligence officers intercepted something unusual, a commissary purchase request from another inmate tied to Hale's old network. The item? Multiple packets of salt and sugar. Individually harmless. Together? Electrolytes. Preparation for a prolonged hunger strike. But this wasn't about protest conditions. It was about leverage. If enough high-profile inmates initiated a coordinated hunger strike, media attention would follow. Lawsuits. Public scrutiny. Pressure on federal administrators. Food was the pressure point. Warden Carter made a decision. At midnight, tactical officers approached cell 214. The heavy door unlocked with a hydraulic hiss. "Hale," Carter's voice echoed through the corridor. "End this now." He looked up slowly. "You control the doors," he said calmly. "You control the lights. But you don't control whether we eat." Carter studied him. "What do you want?" He smiled faintly. "Transparency." In the silence that followed, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The next morning, Claire Donnelly received an unexpected call. The Bureau had approved something unprecedented. Monitored, recorded interviews with select Supermax inmates about the food system. Because someone inside had forced their hand. But when officers opened a locked utility closet beneath cell block D, a space rarely accessed, secured for maintenance only, they found something that changed the entire narrative. Hidden behind a removable panel was a handwritten chart. Mealtimes. Refusal patterns. And at the bottom, one chilling line. Day 7, escalate. The hunger strike wasn't the endgame. It was phase 1. By sunrise, the entire facility was on edge. 7 inmates across 3 separate housing units had now refused 4 consecutive meals. In a Supermax prison, that wasn't a protest, it was a coordinated act of defiance. And defiance, inside walls built for isolation, is currency. Warden Elise Carter stood in the operations center, staring at the live grid of cell feeds. Every movement recorded. Every tray documented. Every refusal logged down to the second. "Medical?" she asked. "Vitals stable for now," the chief medical officer replied. "But if this continues past 72 hours, we're in dangerous territory." Dangerous didn't just mean physical deterioration. It meant media exposure, lawsuits, congressional inquiries. The last thing the Bureau wanted was footage of skeletal inmates claiming starvation inside a federal Supermax. And Marcus Hale knew that. Inside cell D214, Hale paced in slow, deliberate steps. He was conserving energy, but not intention. On his metal desk sat a folded piece of paper, a formal grievance request, neatly written. Subject: nutritional transparency and procurement review. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't aggressive. It was surgical. Claire Donnelly had been granted conditional access to observe food preparation again that morning, but the tone had shifted. Guards were tighter. Doors locked faster. Conversations were shorter. In the kitchen, breakfast trays rolled down the stainless steel assembly line, oatmeal ladled into identical portions, a hard-boiled egg, 2 slices of bread, a small apple. Measured. Counted. So, how often are menus rotated? Claire asked the food services administrator. "Every 4 weeks," he replied. Designed by federal nutritionists. Caloric intake averages 2,600 calories per day. For inmates in solitary confinement? Yes. Claire paused. Isn't that high for minimal physical activity? He hesitated. Standards are standardized. Standardized. The word echoed. Because something didn't add up. According to internal reports she'd reviewed, food costs had decreased over the last 2 fiscal years, yet portion sizes had not officially changed. Suppliers had been renegotiated. Contracts shifted to lower bidders. And in a system built on margins, even pennies matter. By mid-morning, the hunger strike had grown to 11 inmates. Security teams traced communication patterns. The code was simple but effective: accept breakfast, refuse lunch and dinner. Repeat. A rhythm. A signal. Phase 1. Warden Carter authorized a tactical response. Not force. Not yet. But containment. Meal delivery times were staggered. Tray designs were subtly altered. Refusal logs were encrypted and restricted to upper administration only. Cut the signal. Inside D214, the lunch tray slid in. Turkey loaf. Mashed potatoes. Corn. Powdered drink mix. Hale didn't look at it. He sat on the floor, back against the concrete wall, eyes fixed on the camera lens. He knew they were watching. In another block, inmate Darren Cole, serving life for orchestrating organized crime hits across 3 states, collapsed briefly during afternoon count. Medical staff intervened immediately. Dehydration, mild dizziness. But the optics were clear. Claire heard about the incident through a whispered comment in the hallway. "One of them went down," a guard muttered. She requested an interview with medical staff. Denied. Instead, she was escorted to a secure conference room where Warden Carter waited. "You're documenting the food system," Carter said calmly. "So understand this, it meets federal standards. We are not starving anyone." Claire leaned forward. "Then why are they risking their health?" Carter's jaw tightened. "Because food is the only leverage left to them." There it was again. Leverage. Back in her temporary office space, Claire reviewed procurement documents more closely. A pattern emerged. 2 years earlier, the facility had switched to a new supplier for processed proteins and shelf-stable components. Cost reduction, 11%. Quality metrics, equivalent. But buried in footnotes were inmate grievance reports referencing inconsistent texture, undercooked loaf, and reduced portions. Individually minor, collectively unsettling. That evening, dinner trays rolled out, pasta with red sauce, mixed vegetables, a small cookie. Inmate refusals climbed to 15. Medical staff began documenting weight fluctuations. Rapid shifts weren't yet dangerous, but they were measurable. At 8:17 p.m., the facility's internal intelligence unit intercepted something unexpected. Not a coded message. Not a commissary purchase. A lawsuit draft. An inmate in administrative segregation had prepared a handwritten civil complaint alleging systematic manipulation of food quality as behavioral punishment. It cited procurement records, caloric discrepancies, even referenced federal nutritional statutes. The handwriting matched the chart found in the utility closet. This wasn't spontaneous rebellion. It was orchestrated litigation. And Hale was at the center. Warden Carter ordered him moved to a more restrictive observation unit, still solitary, but with enhanced surveillance and medical oversight. When officers entered D214, Hale stood calmly. "You've read it," he said. Carter didn't respond. "You can't control information forever," he continued. "Food is numbers. Numbers leave trails." He wasn't shouting. He wasn't threatening. He was confident. In the observation unit, Hale received a controlled medical evaluation. Blood pressure slightly lowered. Hydration borderline. "You're harming yourself," the medical officer told him. He met her gaze evenly. "No. I'm forcing transparency." Across the compound, tension escalated further. 2 correctional officers reported minor altercations during tray retrieval. Not violence, but resistance. Trays pushed back harder. Delays. Refusals spoken aloud instead of silent. The psychological atmosphere was shifting. Claire finally obtained limited approval to review anonymized nutritional data logs. As she compared intended caloric values against supplier invoices, something subtle but undeniable surfaced. Ingredient substitutions. Soy-based protein replacing poultry in certain batches. Reduced sodium levels altering taste profiles. Vegetable portions slightly smaller than documented serving sizes. Each change within legal tolerance. But collectively, a downgrade. At 2:03 a.m., an emergency alert echoed through the corridor. Inmate Darren Cole had collapsed again, this time striking his head against the concrete floor. Medical response was immediate. He survived. But blood on the gray surface was impossible to ignore. The hunger strike had crossed from symbolic to physical consequence. By dawn, federal administrators in Washington were notified. Media monitoring teams flagged online chatter. Advocacy groups were beginning to ask questions. Inside the operations center, Carter faced her staff. "We will not allow this facility to become a spectacle," she said. "Review every contract. Every supplier. I want answers." Hours later, procurement officers uncovered something alarming. A subcontractor providing bulk processed ingredients had quietly shifted sourcing to a lower-tier manufacturer overseas. Still legal. Still compliant. But cheaper. And less regulated. The difference in taste and texture wasn't imagined. It was engineered. Carter felt the ground shift beneath her authority. She had trusted the system. The numbers. The standards. But Hale had identified the weak link. Food wasn't poisoned. It wasn't toxic. It was downgraded just enough to be unnoticed by oversight, but felt by those eating it daily. At 4:45 p.m., Carter made a call to the Bureau. "Authorize an independent audit," she said. "Immediate." Meanwhile, in the observation unit, Hale finally accepted a tray. Plain rice. Boiled chicken. Water. Medical diet. He ate slowly, deliberately. When Carter entered the observation corridor that evening, she stopped outside his cell. "You got what you wanted," she said quietly. He swallowed and looked up. "Phase 1, he replied. She stiffened. "There is no phase 2. He tilted his head slightly. "You think this was about calories?" Her silence lingered too long. Because while the hunger strike had exposed procurement flaws, intelligence officers had just uncovered something more disturbing. Hidden within commissary purchase records, sugar packets, salt, powdered drink mix, was a second pattern. Ingredients that, when combined correctly, could ferment. Inside sealed containers. Improvised alcohol. A distraction. A cover. Or something worse. And in the confiscated grievance draft, investigators found a second page they hadn't noticed before. A list of cell numbers. Not participants. Targets. Phase 1 had drawn attention to the food system. Phase 2? It was going to use it. By sunrise, The prison no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a countdown. The independent audit had been authorized, but auditors were still days away from stepping inside the gates. Inside the compound, however, time moved differently. Every hour without clarity was an opportunity. Warden Elise Carter hadn't slept. The second page from Hale's grievance draft lay flat on her desk. 12 cell numbers, arranged in a grid pattern. All housed in different units. All inmates classified as high risk. None officially connected, except through food service. Claire Donnelly stood across from her, hands resting on the edge of the desk. You think they're planning something with fermentation? Carter exhaled slowly. Not just alcohol. Alcohol clouds judgment. It creates chaos. Chaos is leverage. Then what? Carter tapped the list. Distribution. Inside the commissary logs, analysts had discovered synchronized purchases over the last 3 months. Sugar packets, yeast-based bread, powdered electrolyte mix, plastic drink pouches. Individually harmless. Together, under the right conditions, volatile. Improvised fermentation wasn't new in prison culture. But coordinated, facility-wide brewing inside a Supermax? That was different. Because in a place where every movement is controlled, even a chemical reaction becomes rebellion. At 9:14 a.m., a correctional officer conducting a random inspection in Housing Unit C discovered a sealed milk carton hidden behind a ventilation grate. Inside, a cloudy liquid mixture, warm to the touch. It was confiscated immediately. Lab results confirmed it, high alcohol content. Stronger than expected. Concentrated. Test the others, Carter ordered. Within hours, 8 more hidden containers were recovered across separate units. Hale had never needed to leave his cell. He had simply provided the blueprint. By afternoon, the real purpose of the list became clear. Each of the 12 inmates marked on that second page occupied cells positioned directly adjacent to service corridors, narrow passageways where meal trays were transferred through mechanical slots. If those containers had fermented longer, the pressure had built. The milk cartons could rupture violently when opened. Not an explosion. Not a bomb. But enough force to spray high-proof liquid into corridors, onto electrical panels, into ventilation ducts. And in a prison built on electronics and isolation, short circuits meant something worse than fire. They meant door failures. System glitches. Momentary blind spots. Carter felt it in her chest, the cold realization. Phase 2 wasn't about intoxication. It was about infrastructure. Claire's voice cut through the silence. They were going to trigger malfunctions during meal delivery. Carter nodded. At the most predictable time of day. Dinner. When every unit cycles simultaneously. At 5:32 p.m., the first malfunction occurred anyway. Housing Unit D experienced a brief electrical flicker. Lights dimmed. Cameras reset for 3 seconds, then returned. 3 seconds. In most facilities, that would mean nothing. Here, it meant a vulnerability. Trace it, Carter snapped. Engineers discovered residue in a lower ventilation duct, sticky, sugar-rich liquid that had seeped into wiring after a confiscated container earlier that morning had leaked during removal. It wasn't catastrophic, but it proved the concept. And Hale had already eaten. In the observation unit, he sat calmly on his bunk, hands folded. He had resumed regular meals after the audit announcement. Cooperative. Composed. Carter entered the corridor, flanked by 2 officers. You are going to weaponize food distribution, she said. Hale met her gaze without blinking. No. Then explain the list. He tilted his head slightly. You see violence everywhere. One of your men already caused a system glitch. He leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. You run a place that isolates human beings 23 hours a day. You control their calories, their light, their speech. And when they organize legally, you call it war. This wasn't legal. Wasn't it? He replied quietly. Improvised fermentation isn't contraband until it's complete. She stared at him. You wanted to prove the system is fragile, she said. No, he corrected. I wanted you to prove it. Back in operations, technicians were reinforcing vulnerable panels. Ventilation ducts were flushed. Commissary purchases were temporarily suspended. Meal trays were now delivered with additional inspection layers. Dinner arrived without incident. But tension hadn't faded. It had hardened. At 8:11 p.m., medical staff reported that 2 inmates, neither on the original list, had begun refusing meals again. Copycats. The idea had spread. The audit team arrived 48 hours later. Federal nutritionists, procurement analysts, independent inspectors. They combed through invoices, freezer inventories, supplier contracts. They confirmed what Claire had suspected. Ingredient substitutions had lowered overall quality, though not enough to violate federal guidelines. Portion weights fluctuated slightly under acceptable tolerances. And if you think this story was intense, you're not ready for what happens when control slips again. Subscribe, because the next case won't stay contained behind concrete walls.